Hi, welcome to a Further Inquiry podcast. I'm Matthew Genorio, Editor-in-Chief of Further Inquiry. Further Inquiry is a place for playing gracefully with ideas. We are a reader-supported publication for free inquiry, brazen critique, and dissenting ideas.
Hi, and I'm Khadija Khan, a journalist and editor at A Further Inquiry. Matthew and I jointly host this podcast monthly. You can support our work by becoming a paid subscriber to A Further Inquiry today.
Well, hello everyone. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, how the heck are you?
Good. Wonderful. Nice to see you, Matt. We've been working together in the Clarity Coalition, and I was hoping I'd be able to chat with you on your program. So great.
Absolutely.
Thanks for finally making it happen.
I'd like to just jump right into it and say, first I got to give you praise. I love the position and those on your side at the Oxford debate. And I'd love for those viewers who have not had the opportunity yet to listen to it. If they don't, I'd say go visit the Oxford debates and Zuhdi's position on it. But why is this something that is not talked about or given the taboo topic? What you raised, especially with the idea of Islam as a brand and schools of thought, these should not be taboo topics of discourse or discussion, but yet they seem to have taken that as being a taboo conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks again. We had that debate in October, and there were a lot of protesters there, and the audience was loaded with folks, not only Islamist apologists, but anti-Israel and from other communities that I've been fighting my whole life, if you will. Just to start off, I'm the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. My day job is as a physician, but after 9/11, I served in the Navy 11 years until 99, and then came here to Arizona, where I'm based in Phoenix, to join my dad in practice. A couple years later, the 9/11 happens, and I started to notice on the media who was speaking for Muslims and what it was that was quote-unquote Islam. As I wrote in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I basically learned in college at the University of Wisconsin that my understanding of Islam was not the dominant bandwidth Islam that is the brand that is Islam, and again, Islam to a Muslim is basically God's religion. So I'm not trying to in any way portray that I know what God's religion necessarily is, but Islam on earth is a human manifestation of God's, what we believe to be God's scripture, and that brand, normative Islam, is not compatible with Western ideas, is not compatible with Western democracy, and it is either deception, it is, to answer your question, a bigotry of low expectations that we have of Muslims globally, where we basically want to hand them a participation trophy in Islam and democracy and say, okay, fine, you guys are compatible. It doesn't matter that wherever you organize and wherever you're a majority, you do away with minority rights, you slaughter those who practice things that you disagree with, you believe that we have some type of exclusivity to heaven, and all of these things. I grew up in a family that very intellectually diverse and very intellectually rigorous on Islam, so I didn't approach it from a non-Muslim, from a mild, a nominal Muslim, as many might be. I embrace my faith. I consider myself Orthodox, but at the end of the day, I started to understand that I'm a heretic when it comes to the Islamist leadership globally. And the debate in Oxford in October was about whether Islam is compatible with democracy. And they had, one side where all Muslims saying that it was compatible, and then my side was the only Muslim on that side saying, listen, it's not about whether it can be. I do believe it can be. Otherwise, I wouldn't be, contented here in the West, growing up in America, feeling that I could practice my faith more freely in the West than I could anywhere in the world under Muslim majority rule, so that we can talk about later. But at the end of the day, that incompatibility is aspirational to say it's compatible. So that was my position, that in 2025, 2024, a few months ago, it was not compatible. It won't be compatible in the next few years. But aspirationally, there are interpretations that I got either from my family, from reformists, and we formed our Muslim reform movement about the fact that we believe there are deep reforms necessary to make it compatible.
Absolutely.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you on your brilliant speech at Oxford. I watched it and I was like, wow, because I know my journey as a Muslim, when I Well, I was born and raised in Muslim majority country in a very conservative Islamic Muslim society, and for me, when I would see, the problems that you just mentioned, for me, the sole solution was to reform the religion, to just remove the bad bits and then just to bring forth the good bits and encourage people to reform their attitudes towards, different ideas that they get from the religious discourse. However, later I realized that people who are talking about reforms, first of all, they are not paid due attention, I would say. And second, when they talk about reforming Islam, I see like they become a bit of apologetic, at some point, that they don't want to actually reform Islam. They want to keep Islam as it is. And then they want other people to just don't look at the bad bits of Islam, to be honest, if I put it bluntly. So, how do you see that? How can Islam be reformed?
Well, first of all, we have to, it's almost like we need a 12-step program as intoxicants from the toxin of political Islam, which is theocratic Islam. And the first step is always to get past denial and recognize humbly that Al Qaeda, ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islamiyah in Pakistan, the Khomeinists in Iran, there's a reason that a faith of a quarter of the world's population, which 1.7 or so billion Muslims, you could easily say 25 to 40% are harboring a theopolitical ideology that is not only supremacist, but has created these cancer metastases, if you will, that needs to be treated. So as a doctor, I've said, listen, I don't just treat symptoms and give people morphine and cough suppressants when they're sick. I treat the disease. The disease within the ummah, the political Islamic community in Arabic, is the ummah. The disease, ummah has two meanings. It means either people of followers of Islam, but it also means state. And our American Islamic Forum for Democracy said until the Muslim community says that the state, Islamic State, goes in the dustbin of history, and we say that with the Islamic State comes national identity, Islamofascism, comes a constitution in which the Quran is not the source, but is not a source, but the source of Islam, of the law, and Sharia is not only one of the sources, but the only instrument of legalisms within that state. Those are incompatible with modernity, with freedom, and those are the areas of reform. So when we had this debate, I said, listen, let's talk about terms. Islam is a religion, and if you say that it's God's religion that can't be reformed, which is really the answer we get from even many millions of so-called moderate Muslims, oh, you can't reform it, it's done, that's why it's in the scripture. Well, anything that you read and interpret from the Quran that's in Arabic, all of the English translations that are just anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, anti-Western, that the Saudis call the Jews not their friends. They have footnotes that they add other things. I don't believe those are Quran. I believe the only thing that is the Quran is the Arabic word, and then what's human is its translation. So we have to begin to say the terms to understand what those terms are. While the word Islam means surrender to God's will, we also have to have the human element, which is debate on what is and what is not Islam. And that's why really debate is the key to, and this is not unique to Islam. The West took 1789 years until they understood what it meant in the Bible to render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God's what is God's. And I think similarly, they also had a very bloody enlightenment process of the 30 Years' War, where 8 to 10 million people perished fighting against theocrats. And I think that's where Islam is right now.
Yeah, you make it a great comparison there too. It is. I always like to say when that analogy is given, as opposed to the European continent being the battlefield, now it's the world is the battlefield, and you have different factions, as it were, fighting for the narrative, the interpretation. I think that most people are just detached from that. They don't understand what's going on. They think, the default is a critique automatically goes to Islamophobia, when when somebody who I'll give anyone the credit, they're probably guided with a good heart, but they're being dragged into a bigger conversation that they don't know about and being pushed to a side that is not that is enabling the very side that wants to oppress and wants to twist and turn scripture into something purely hateful as opposed to something divine and beautiful and meaningful to so many.
And the way to take away the militarization of Islam that's happened in the last millennium, the way to take away the nuclear energy that is what not only the reason Iran should not have a nuclear weapon, but their nuclear power comes from the sense that at the end of the day, I was in the Navy. When I served in the Navy, I agreed to serve 4 years. I served 11 years. But if at year two, when I was in a ship off the shore of Mogadishu and we were in a war and to Operation Restore Hope, and I said, oh, I'm changing my mind. I don't want to serve anymore. Let me go. You can't do that, even in a democracy, because there's concepts of unit cohesion, national identity. You serve your country, the military force. So what happened is, and this might be an apologetic to some, but at the end of the day, at the time, the Prophet Muhammad was not only the messenger of God, we believe, that in Arabic brought the scripture, but was the head of state and also the head of a military. He had a Muslim military that was fighting against pagans. Islam did not come to convert Judaism, Christianity, by the way. It really came and was revealed to pagans. Those Muslims that were in his military, some that wanted to leave, were committing truly acts of treason at the time. So what's happening is the Islamists have picked and chosen laws from 1400 years ago where there was no technology of liberal democracy. It didn't exist. The world, the dynasties of Islam actually were the Elon Musks of the time were creating, and Maimonides did his greatest work, and that's not apologetics. The reality is if the recipe of Islam truly snuffed out free thinking, truly, you wouldn't have had 4,000 schools of Sharia from 700 to 1100. There was a lot of diversity of Islamic thought. Now there's 4 schools. So it's gone. And at the end of the day, the jihadists feel that that's part of belonging to every Muslim, that you are part of the jihad. So the only way to take away that nuclear idea is to end the Islamic State. Once you end the Islamic State, there's no jihad, there's no Islamic military, there's no Islamic constitution. All of those things then become modernized, and that's why I learned the most from Bassam Tibi's book on Islamism. He said Christianity was liberated through the secularization of society. That's his quote. And the former president of Indonesia, on the front of his book on the Islamic State, against the Islamic State, he said that you need a state of Islam in your heart, but the nation should never be an Islamic state. And that was his quote about that.
I completely agree with you. It's a matter of interpretation. In Islam, largely people, they adhere to an interpretation which is very radical and literal. And that is the reason that we see intolerance among Muslims when it comes to talk about religion or anything that is associated with religious belief. So how do you see that Muslims who are radical, to be very honest, they say that there is a majority which is very peaceful, but that majority is somehow irrelevant. It's silent because when we see incidents when people who are quote unquote disrespecting Islam, they are being threatened or they are being attacked or targeted or in worst cases killed, then that silent majority, they do condemn the violence, but they don't condemn the teachings, the beliefs that drive these people to that, extreme. So how this majority can be stimulated and encouraged to come forward and take the lead?
Well, thank you. That's exactly why we formed our Muslim Reform Movement. It's why we formed the Clarity Coalition. We realized that us Muslim reformers, that include many of your friends, Rahil Raza and Soraya Dean, Ezra Nomani, and so many others that were in the Muslim Reform Movement, we did one thing. We made a 2-page declaration that said if people believe in these principles, there's no way they could be Islamic State adherents. Not just ISIS, but any Islamic State, political Islam, if you will, or Islamists. But beyond that, we said, okay, there's a lot of folks in the anti-jihad space and the Save the West space that are trying to protect us from not only Islamists, but their antagonists that are trying to destroy the West, which are the Marxists, the progressivists on the far left that have basically empowered the Islamists and are part of the two ends of the triangle, Russia, China, and Marxists, and then the Islamists that are working against the West to try to destroy and contain us, if you will. So if you look, the problem is we've never had an offense. The West has always been apologetic, saying, "Oh, America is all about blue jeans, rock and roll, etc. We're not going to change the Middle East. We're not going to change the world. We just want to make sure you know that we're not into nation building anymore, etc." Well, that's fine, but the reason the West is falling apart is China had an offense into universities to destroy us. The Islamists, Iran and others had an offense with every Islamic group that are brotherhood operatives in mosques across this country that have tried to destroy us, from Iran to Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis and other petro-Islamic trillionaires are dumping their money rather into folks like you and me and reformists to save the West. They're dumping trillions into cities in the desert that steal technology from the West. They're not putting it into human ingenuity, protecting individual rights, poetry, music, creativity, things that truly are human, but rather simply technology. And I say, as an Islamic reformer, that, you know, if you believe in modern medical science and modern computer science that they use and are building all this technological stuff, you have to believe in modern political science and liberal science. So these humanities are where we need to put money into and find resources of folks that will allow us to be, have a seat at the table and not be on the menu, and be able to tell the Saudis and others that they are the reason there's not one product that's come out of Saudi Arabia or any Muslim majority country worth talking about. Not one. Because those people that are creative get put into prison or come to the West. That's how you begin to reform, is you need to have the ability to have individual rights protected, give them the freedom like they have in Israel and elsewhere to build. That's why one of my criticisms of President Trump's build up Gaza, God bless him, I'm glad he's talking about that, but that's going to be Qatar unless you first say, let's build up and protect the startups and the individual free thinkers.
Right. Absolutely.
That's true, that free thinkers, they have been silenced, they have been, and you talk about far left. I think the free thinkers of the Muslim societies, they have been thrown under the bus by the far left in the West, and they are largely responsible for the rise of Islamism because they have been pandering to the extreme and radical attitudes within certain sections of Muslim communities here in the West. And now we see, as you mentioned, that nothing productive is coming out of Muslim majority countries. But here in the West, we see the ever-growing religiosity, the show of religion, that is becoming priority for these Muslims. How many times you offer prayer in library, on the road, instead of offering prayer in the mosque, they are offering prayer everywhere in the society. They are taking places, claiming public discourse by just wearing religion on their sleeves 24/7. But that is not taking them anywhere near to that productivity that we are just talking about. That is progressive, that can lead us to liberalism. So what is the solution? Where they are going and how they can be directed in the right direction, where they can just start thinking about doing something productive other than just wearing religion on their sleeves.
Yeah, I think there's short-term and long-term solutions. The short-term solutions, unfortunately, was to, and I think President Trump in his first term was correct in doing the Abraham Accords and trying to bring some stability to the recognition of Israel, and work with some of the countries that would at least recognize Israel, recognize Western nations, not be obsessed on anti-Semitism, etc. And you saw Bahrainis and Emiratis and others, maybe Saudi Arabia, and maybe, and actually Morocco's part of it and others. So that, I think you're going to see Abraham Accords 2.0. But what we learned from the Iraq War and others is that you can't militarily win this. There's no
Yeah.
military solution. So it's not just about stability, because, with stability, they thought they got security and we got neither. What we need is an offense to begin long-term projects to protect the women. For example, the best anti-nuclear program in Iran is going to be protecting the women's movement and working with all of the anti-theocratic movements on the ground that is happening from city to city in Iran. And once the maximum pressure program gets back, you'll see that they won't have the money to put not only into their nuclear program, which is a nihilistic effort to bring sort of the end of times, and we have to stop that, but also to prevent Iran from fueling Hamas and all the radicalization, and then have a counter to the main problem, which is Al Jazeera.
Mhm.
So Al Jazeera is radicalizing 60 million Arabs that watch it every day. And as it radicalizes that huge population, where's the volume of discussions like this podcast should be seen on by millions of Arabs, translated into every language from Urdu to Pashto and Arabic and Farsi, etc. And we're not doing that. So I'm hoping with Carrie Lake now at Voice of America and Brent Bozell in there and Senator Rubio, Secretary Rubio now, these folks have a sense of what a war of ideas would be. And it's not just anti-terror. Actually, in one of the answers to Matt's early question, I wanted to say at the periphery of the circle of war, if you will, is the violent ones. So you've got the theocratic Islamists that are militant, Al Qaeda and ISIS, and you've got the secular fascists that are like the Nazis, Arabists, etc., that we see in our countries in the West also, but also in the Middle East, which are the fascist militaries. In the middle, you've got liberalism. So that debate, whether it's the civilizational jihadists that might not be violent, they consider themselves to be moderate, but they're not moderate. They're incompatible with Western ideas. And the liberals in the middle that are fighting both the communist militants and the Islamists, that's where the future of the planet is, I think, and where we need to push this out at universities, on media, social media, and traditional media, and begin to have this debate about what is a type of tough love for Muslims. Should we not have them accountable to 21st century principles, or continue this bigotry of low expectations and participation trophies that we keep giving them instead of actually holding them accountable?
I couldn't agree more with you on this one,
That's true.
Judy. I couldn't agree more. I think, there's also the emboldening by these, for lack of a better word, the collection of woke, radical elements, groups, etc. on the left. There is something to say about the Red-Green Alliance that want everything to crumble internally. How do you stop that at an academic level? Because you're right, you're getting the funding in. These are students who otherwise have no engagement with Islam, who otherwise have no engagement sometimes with other ways of thinking, but are getting these particular positions on topics, social political topics from abroad. And as we even see from October 7th onward, the engagement is propaganda, basically based in propaganda, but based in real world consequences too.
Yeah, Matt, this is so important, because let's bookmark October 7th for a second, and let's talk about that later, because it's such a sentinel moment that was an inflection point. But I want to talk about the red-green axis first. I was writing about the red-green axis and didn't call it that until Ezra and I basically started to talk about that in 2012, 13, after the Arab awakening. I wrote a piece about the Egyptian revolution, in which I talked about how the NDP, the National Democratic Party of Mubarak, and before him Jamal Abdel Nasser, my grandfather, Zudi Jasser, at the time was in and out of house arrest in Syria. Syria had 20 different coups that happened between 1952 and 1963, until the Ba'ath, the National Socialist Fascists of Syria, took over. From 58 to 61 was the combined socialist government of Egypt and Syria, in which then ultimately Jamal Abdel Nasser took over, and they separated from Syria, and the Ba'athists took over and then became the Assad regime ultimately. That social fascists were collectivists, socialists, working with, many ways, the Islamists. Now, back and forth over time, Nasser claimed to be anti-Islamist. He'd let them rise in the Egyptian government and then put them all in prison. This back and forth, yin and yang, was a useful idiots, if you will, in order to create a milieu, just like Assad with ISIS. Assad allowed ISIS to grow, didn't fight them. It took the U.S. 6 months with General Mattis to actually destroy ISIS, while he completely destroyed 800,000 and killed hundreds of thousands of innocents in Syria, because He used them as a foil. The Saudis, same thing. The top 10 users of Twitter in Saudi Arabia with 10 million, 8 million, 7 million followers are Wahhabis. And the Saudis let them speak, but the Muslims that leave Islam, the former Muslims, the Shia in Saudi Arabia are all in prison and prisoners of conscience. So ultimately that red-green alliance is about collectivism. They share pathways in fighting against individual folks that believe in individual liberty, so that at the end they will ultimately fight each other. We saw it with the Socialist Workers' Party in Germany and in France that initially worked with Tariq Ramadan, the grandson of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they put up a web page at the end in which they said, these are the reasons we shouldn't be working with this guy because he's a misogynist and all the things that Khadija was saying that the leftists always, you wonder, what are they doing working with them as the Code Pink ladies are in Tehran? It makes no sense. And so ultimately, as we look at what we should be doing into the future, I think this is the hope for us, because for us reformers, because finally the West sees this as their ideas are at stake. It's no longer just, hey, Zudi, I know you have a problem within Islam. God bless you, thank you, but you're on your own. I can't fix that. That now they realize that the Soroses, the communists, and others that are also wanting to destroy us because they're collectivists and they don't believe in capitalism are the ones that are actually going to also destroy our society as we know it today.
I think I don't know about the liberal left in the West, how they are going to save their hard-earned values. All I can see is that the people like you who believe in Western values, which are universal values, and people, the dissenters of Islam, I think they are the ones who are going to stand for these values. And when we talk about the progressives in the West, I think they have already given up these hard and values in order to appease certain section of the society. And it's really to see them being inclined towards an ideology which is radical and extreme. And West has its own history of fighting against religious orthodoxy. And the whole period of enlightenment, it was a fruit of putting religion out of political and social discourse, putting it in personal sphere. So you think that if Islam is placed in personal sphere instead of political or social sphere, then Muslims can be progressive in their attitudes and in their interaction with their fellow citizens here in the West.
Wow, I'm so glad you asked me that. Thank you, because there is such a key part of this debate in the West that is actually drives a wedge between the right and the left when talking about religion. And you see the right, which I'm a part of as a conservative, the right completely misuse, misunderstand, and work with Islamists who they think share their values because they might be pro-life, because they're about family values, and then ultimately they actually want to destroy the constitutional values that conservatism is all about. The answer to your question is that I beg folks to please look back at Western history and understand the debate that happened in Europe and happened at the formation of America about the separation of church and state. Very different than the debate in America today about the separation of church and state. The far left, the hyper-secularists that want to get religion out of every part of our practice publicly is not the debate about religion and church and state that happened in 1776. There's a reason the word Christian is not in the founding documents in the United States. And I think the answer to you, Khadija, is that this is one of the reasons, and I know I'm talking to two Canadians. I think you're both Canadians, right, Khadija?
I'm from UK.
You're UK, I'm sorry. Okay. So I know I'm talking to two Westerners that
Members
are
of the
not
Commonwealth.
American.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But the Americanism is, our first freedom is religious liberty. 65% of America now, actually going up for the first time in the past few years, go to church and go to religious worship once a week. Much different than the numbers in Europe. So I think that a lack of a religious identity is actually a jet fuel for political Islam. And I think ultimately, if you're going to reform Islam, the Tariq Ramadans of the world were able to spread like wildfire. The folks that were walking through the streets of Paris in their hijab, and the hijab was no longer a personal faith practice. It became a flag of a nation state rather than a personal faith practice. So these issues get muddled, and I find conservatives who I thought understood what I was saying not understanding history, where I, as an American, would not want to live under any other document but the American Constitution because it has a First Amendment that prevents the establishment of religion through government. That's the First Amendment. That's what Islam needs to understand and go through its and of its reform, is that you cannot have a constitution based in Islam. That word should not be in a state constitution. Their national identity should be based on a shared ideology where Christians, Jews, non-Muslims, people of no faith, agnostics can come together and form a united ideology under that flag, but not under the flag of Islam. So that discussion of, for example, France's laïcité policies are problematic when you're going to fight political Islam, because the Islamists say, oh, they want to take religion out of your life completely. They won't even let you wear the kippah. They won't let you wear a cross, all these things. And, those of us, that are religious will say, wow, that I don't like that. I want religious freedom. I protect folks' right to burn the Quran, God forbid. I will protect their right to the death, as Voltaire or whoever said that in history. But they should also protect my right to publicly display my religion.
I think it's a fair argument that religious people should be free to practice their religion. And I think that the freedom Muslims enjoy here in the West in order to practice their religion, they don't have in Muslim majority country. I am from a Muslim majority country. I know that the Muslims are not free. But there are problems, there are issues, and first of all, there is a complete absence of freedom of speech. This is something that is not even considered a human right. And speaking of being from the UK, I would like to ask you about something which is very much, in talk these days here in the UK. It's the definition of Islamophobia. There is a lobby working, behind this one term of Islamophobia, and now the Labour government, they have formed a council to deliberate on the definition of Islamophobia, and they are insisting on making it all about a kind of racism, and the whole definition is absurd. And if you go through the whole definition, you will see that anything, you talk about hijab, you talk about radical attitude among Muslims, you talk about any issue which is related to radical and extreme attitude within certain section of Muslim community, you talk about it and you will be labeled as an Islamophobe. So how do you see that Western government, Western politicians, they are working hand in gloves, with this lobby in order to present this one term Islamophobia as a legal terminology, because as I see it, it is a synonym for blasphemy here in the UK as it's being practiced. What are your thoughts on it?
I agree with you 100%. It's basically that word was concocted by the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, in the late 80s, early 90s, and they didn't come up with it overnight. It basically was a transplant into the world, into the UN, of what they do domestically in every one of their countries. Is that the Saudis, when they put thousands of prisoners of conscience into prison, they do it not because they have criticize the king or criticize the legal system or the government. They're in jail because of law of speech against Islam, for apostasy, for blasphemy, for sedition against the Islamic State. All these things are about speech, and it's about speech against Islam because those government leaders, those clerics, see themselves as God. Astaghfirullah, as we say in Arabic. But that's, so you can't speak against them. The West took that term and ran with it. And instead of, listen, I acknowledge that there's some bigotry there in the West, everywhere, that might exist against various people, and Muslims are not immune to that. But there's bigotry against Muslims. Islamophobia, Islam is not a human being. It's an idea. People have a right to disagree with it, to torch it, do what they want with the idea. My closest friends, many of them are atheists. That's their relationship with God. I would die for them. I served in the military with folks of all different religion. or no religion. So Islamophobia is a term that creates an identity politic, and I think that's the cancer. It's the fact that the West now has become so obsessed with identity politics. And I've talked to folks in the gay community that are extremely upset with what's happening on transgenderism, for example,
Oh,
where all of a sudden we're debating about what is a man, what is a woman, and it's all about identity politics, where you saw them doing things legislatively that makes no sense in order to protect 0.001% of the population against core values that 80% of the voting people disagree with in America about gender identity. Same thing. That's why if you look at UC Berkeley, Islamic studies and gender identity are like in the same department. The guy who runs is the Students for Justice of Palestine founder in America, was from UC Berkeley and is still chair. Hatem Bassian, if you will, that's his name. Hatem Bassian that's his chair. So it's like
they don't make
it's
it,
all
they
the
don't make it
same
easy on
cancer
themselves,
cell.
do they?
What?
They don't make it easy on themselves, do they? They just
I know.
it's
It's all a cultish, as I see it. I mean, it's the cultish attitude that you cannot talk about it, you cannot discuss it, you cannot touch on these ideas because these are sacred ideas. Somehow, talking about ideas is equal to, bigotry against people. I think this is where the lines have been blurred. And the problem is that it's not the extremist or radical or neo Nazis, it's the liberal left. That is what bugs me really, because I'm someone who identifies herself as a liberal. And for me, it's like they are not doing anything that I can relate to. For me, it's like, no, I don't believe in these kind of attitude, because these attitudes are cultish attitudes. It's not progressive. It's not liberalism. So for me, it's like, this is where we are making a mistake, but are we going to learn from it?
I think they will. I think ultimately, if you look at what's happening in universities, what the value systems of what they're seeing, the legacy they're leaving for their kids and their grandkids, the institutional educational systems, the centrists, if you will, in America, I've talked to many of them. I've got a large medical practice, and when I was running for office last year, many folks were just sort of talking to me about the issues of the day. And my patients were like, Zudi, I disagree with you on a lot of issues politically, but we need folks like you in in Congress, federally, wherever it might be, because the people leading us today, so many of them are simply demagogues. They tell people what they think they want to hear, and they don't actually stand for anything. So actually, I think you're going to see some whiplash of folks leaving the left party, and coming to the center and working with folks that they might disagree with on many things, but yet on the core things they agree with: national identity, borders, national security, free market issues. Not necessarily, we might not agree on how free market, but at the end of the day, free market issues. So there's going to be some core issues, and free speech is another one. I think the left at some point is going to realize that they should also be the party of free speech. I don't get
right.
it. They're the ones who were all about burning the flag and all these things in the 60s and 70s, that they were anti-war and all that. That's about free speech. And yet they seem to no longer care about
You know
those
that
issues. So I think it'll come back.
that's always, I think, ever more becoming an interesting topic for me, Zuda, that you touch on, especially in America, especially on the left in the U.S. Because, and just for that point, I'm always reminded of that 1960s adaptation of A Man for All Seasons, and that great quote was, if you're going after, I think that the quote was, "The devil cornered you in an alleyway," or something like that, and would you tear down all the laws in England to capture the devil? And of course I would. Oh, and where would you turn now, having torn down all the laws, having done everything to yourself? Because everything that you've now put in play doesn't just have effect on this particular person or entity, but it has great effect subsequently on you and can be used against you. And I don't think they rationally, conceptually understand that yet. That these positions, these very extreme positions they're taking, aren't just a one-off, but if once you're legislating it, it can be utilized and weaponized ipso facto against you. And they don't realize that, and they don't get that you need the public sphere, the public space, to be a place of debate, freedom of expression, where you can get to this marketplace of ideas. What is worthwhile? What is junk? What can we dismantle? And even this idea too of anyone who went to university in the last 30 years, I'm no exception. I had to work my way through it. Is dismantling, deconstructing. And at some point, I had to figure out, well, what are we going to build? What are we maintaining? Can we not just say something has some essence of good to it, or something, or, even if you just wanted to tear down everything, what are you building? There's never an example given. It's just tear down, deconstruct.
And if I could just, I think one of the things that if you look in history, movements are created by folks that talk about ideas of what they would die for.
Hmm.
And I think ultimately, as much as none of us want to get into violence, at the end of the day, effective movements are based on things that you want to protect that you would die for. Jihadists radicalize their communities by saying that they're not dying for anything on this earth, they're dying for God, so it doesn't matter who they take with them. And I think similarly on the far left, you saw folks that, terror groups or whatever it might be, that talked about what they would die for in the 60s and 70s, et cetera. And we've lost that. I think that discussion is that, the legacy that I'm trying to leave behind for my kids and my grandkids is the only thing I would die for is Americanism. Not only Americanism as a national identity, but as an idea. So, what is the idea that is Americanism? It's about immigrants coming together, regardless of race, creed, national origin, whatever it might be. They come together under the rubric that we protect each other's individual rights and freedoms as based in our First Amendment, Second Amendment to bear arms, and our Bill of Rights, if you will. Those rights are protected where you, by protecting the individual, you protect the group, but you don't protect the group at the expense of the individual. That was turned upside down, and appropriately so that we had a culture that protected individual rights. That to me is Americanism. And I think Westernism also is where that came from. Those are the things we are, it's like when you want to fight drugs on the streets, whether it's cocaine, meth, whatever it is, you don't just tell them it's bad, stop doing it. You give the kids in the next generation something to do, something to be and believe in, that no longer will they reach for the drugs. That's the only way. Rehab, recidivism, and we talked about that early on, which was, counterterrorism might work sometimes, but the 90% of the time they click back into political Islam and it's a waste of time. But a movement for Americanism and Westernism will insulate us, inoculate us from that radicalism. And the red green axis, the Democratic Party in the US is radicalized. There is no doubt. What we saw in the joint session of Congress earlier last week
That
was
was a display.
radicalized. It was these are group people that just hate America. They wouldn't even clap on the things that we agree on. It's folks that are like a estranged couple that now is just trying to be divorced at all times instead of coming together on the things that we believe in together. It's crazy.
So, I'd like to
It's a
expand on that.
guilt dripping left.
I completely agree with you. I'd like to expand what you're saying there on identity politics, because and things you want to fight for and die for. What are your thoughts, Zudi? And I'm sure they're probably brilliant on this one, but what are your thoughts on something that I think because you and I were talking in the pre-chat about this. It's a growing concern for some time in the UK. It has problems in Canada, but I don't think there is research as much. I know the UK in the U.S. has them within Muslim communities in the U.S. and the Great Britain and in Canada. The crisis of identity, particularly with the crisis of identity with Muslim male youth, and the tug and pull of narrative, of identity, and the pulling into the extremism, as opposed to the pulling into rationality, to Americanism, to the diversity in a healthy sense. What is fostering that? What is emboldening that to be this crisis of identity?
Yeah, I think in all these discussions of toxic masculinity and all these other things, I mean, every, whether it's male or female, the bottom line is that we have lost the culture of pride, of what we believe in, being proud of our country, proud of our family, that of the ideas that we believe in and that we share. And ultimately, the identity politics has made it all about targeting various groups as being the problem and then creating a victim class in which the victimhood, the victimology, then becomes the obsession, in which, and this is actually could lead us to the conversation about Israel, is that, the West's guilt has allowed billions upon billions to be funneled into the Palestinians and rebuilt. And we went from the 48 to 56 to 67 to 73, then to 82 and to 2006 and 2014. Every time we have war, and Israel gets to the edge of actually defeating them, and then they stop. The UN's obsessed on it, and it's all about identity politics, that the Palestinians are the victims, and somehow this minority that had almost half of its global population wiped out in the Holocaust, that somehow they're not the victim. I would tell you that if we had tough love for the Palestinians, we would make sure that they had an unconditional surrender, that they would unconditionally surrender. Enough talk of the two-state solution. That's 20th century technology. First century technology, the discussion of Israel should be about unconditional surrender, the way happened to the Japanese, the way it happened with Germans. Unsustainable ideologies that are incompatible with humanity will only be defeated when, the emperor's religion was
Hmm.
finally thrown in the wastebasket of history after we defeated them in World War II. So that's a tough conversation. We can have that. But I do think identity politics creates this thing where all of a sudden, everything in the world was America's fault, was our fault, a white person's fault, Jewish fault, all these things in which they started creating classes that it was okay to discriminate against. And by the way, what got us out of that? It wasn't popular vote, it was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that that was discrimination against Asian community, against the Jewish community and others. So some of that's going to be corrected by a system that protects minorities. So identity politics actually will slowly be unroofed as the racism of the 21st century and the 20th century, and ultimately that's how it will be defeated.
Here,
I
here.
think people here in the West, some people they suffer from savior complex, and in order to feel better about themselves, they have infantilized
Yes.
ethnic minorities here in the West. There is no agency. I mean, Muslims, they cannot be treated as equally as other people. Like you have to be very sensitive when you are talking about certain things, because you cannot expect from Muslims to be grown up, to be mature, to be sensible, to be wise or prudent when they are responding to any argument. So for me, it's like not about protecting minorities, it's about making them feel good about themselves. And that is the savior complex. And again, it's a form of racism as I see it, that they want to put themselves in a higher place, ethnic minorities in the lower and inferior place, where they can just look at them and just feel sad about them, and then feel an urge, to protect them. It's this kind of circle, and it's a sad reality, I think, that we people from ethnic background, we have fallen for it.
And you look at the African American community in America, so many unbelievable African American scholars on the right, not only Clarence Thomas, so many others, Sowell and others have talked about this at length and written about it. And then we had the Black Lives Matter movement, which basically stepped all over the conservative African American community, saying that they were Uncle Toms, etc. And I was called an Uncle Tom nationally after 9/11 because I was basically calling a spade and identifying where the problems were that created the radicalizations. These things, and if you look at the BLM movement, it was co-chaired by the Farrakhan movement, a Nation of Islam, by so many of the folks that were actually virulent anti-Semites. So, I think the Jewish community has sadly, unfortunately, been at the head of the spear against, if you look in history, they come for them first, and then they'll eventually come for the rest of us.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happening, is that the far left, the fascists are targeting, and they did that through the BLM movement and the racial identity movement that's continuing to grow, but I think will ultimately ratchet back. And we're seeing some of that where you are in Europe. I mean, right now, you've got some movements that are sort of doing a yin and yang, if you will, to what the progressivists were trying to do. And now you're having Italy and France and Britain and others Germany have movements that, are not exactly about liberalism that are coming back.
Oh, okay, well, I think it's time to wrap up the discussion. And before we leave and let you go, it's International Women's Day, and we all celebrate it, and we all wish women the best and in their struggles. They have different struggle in different forms and shapes. I want to ask you a it's a very difficult question for me to put, but still, I want you to express your thoughts on it. That we are talking about women's right, but in defending women's right, we are very selective here in the West. We don't raise voice for all women. It's always about what suits my narrative. And the prime example I want to give you is about Yazidi women. Yazidi women were targeted. They were like, it was a genocide against Yazidi people, and especially Yazidi people, women. They received the worst treatment under IS, Islamic State. However, we didn't see the Western liberals, raising their voices in order to bring the culprit to justice. And the same thing happened on October 7th when Jewish women were they were raped and killed by Hamas fighters, terrorists. Then people were quiet. First they were quiet, and then they denied everything that happened. For them, nothing happened on that day. So for me, it's like people here in the West, they are being very selective when it comes to defending women's rights. How do you see that?
Well, you're right. It wasn't on my speech on camera at Oxford, but I turned around. There was a picture of Benazir Bhutto behind me, and she had gone to Oxford. And I said, sadly, as much respect as we have for the fact that she didn't necessarily even wear the hijab, she was nothing better than window dressing for a society that was anti-woman, anti-freedom, and basically she was part of the royalty, if you will. And many of these royal families in these countries are not held accountable for the realities of what's happening to women. And I will say this as a man that 25 years from now, I may not be alive, but if we defeat political Islam, it will be because of the women's movements within the Muslim community. They have been so abused and tortured. They have been not given positions of leadership. And if you look at the beginning of revolutions, I've talked to Syrians in Syria, and if you look at a lot of the movements that ultimately got rid of Assad, it was the women's movements in many of the cities. They didn't get the credit because they're not doing the fighting and necessarily all of the militancy that defeats in war. But at the end of the day, they're the mass movements of communication networks and others. I mean, look at our reform movement. I cited for you the 3 or 4 folks that are part of our leadership, and I'm the only guy there. So men are conveniently silent and realize, and I think ultimately it's going to come from economic freedom. If you look at the Malalas of the world, the Fatima Marnisis of the world who wrote a book about Islam and democracy, many of them were able to do so because they were no longer economically dependent on their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, and they could interpret their Quran, their faith or no faith in the way they wanted to. So that really is why we should, celebrate women's freedoms and know that if you look that if Iran ever gets done with its Islamic theocracy, it'll be because of women's freedom and their courage, and we should protect their rights. It's interesting. The Islamists always talk about the right of women to wear hijab in the West. What about the right not to wear it or to have bodily autonomy,
Exactly.
physical autonomy? The debate about FGM is just horrifies me that debate has to happen, and somehow the clerics, when they give I wrote a piece that would never get published, that 3 different newspapers rejected it, about an imam that was abusive towards some of the women in our community here in Arizona, and the title of it was "Me Too Except for Muslims," because it was at the height of the Me Too movement, like you were talking about just now. It was at the height of the Me Too movement, but it wasn't convenient because the Muslim community are a protected class, so we can't talk about that with them, but we should talk about it with everybody else. So, thank you for that. We hope we can do more than talk about International Women's Day on just one day, but there were other 364 days a
Yes,
year.
very well said. I would say everything you said, I agree with it. The movements we are having at the moment within the Muslim communities, we can see the fruit coming out of that. And yes, the attitude to defend women's rights in the West, I think that has to change, because unless you put off the glasses of prejudice, what women should be protected and how women should be protected. I think that is the problem we are having at the moment in the West when we talk about women's rights. Thank you so much, Judy,
Thank
for
you.
being with us. And it was really a pleasure, a true pleasure to have you. And I am so hopeful, really. It's just Matthew. Hello,
Okay.
Matthew. Where are you? We
I am ready. I presume your end is frozen too, right?
No, we have been talking actually.
Everything just froze for me.
Oh, okay. So would you like to join us or we just wrap up here?
Continue the conversation
Uh-huh.
and conclude as you feel necessary.
Okay.
I was gonna add a question if you don't mind adding on my part.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Closing question.
Perfect.
Ask him. Zudi's book is Battle for the Soul of Islam. Ask him like Zudi, what is the soul of Islam?
Oh, okay.
I'm frozen. I think it's a software issue on my computer. Once you're done, just let me know. I'll. I think can you end it on your end?
Oh, yeah, yeah, I can do that.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. So here is the question for you, Judy. Another question. What is the soul of Islam?
Well, thank you. I hope folks, as they listen to our conversation, start to have many similar conversations with the people they know in their lives and nationally and locally, wherever they are. And look at our Clarity Coalition website, Clarity, Champions for Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny, CLARITY coalition.org. You know, the soul of Islam to me, and that's why I wrote that book, was not only it's my story, but it talks about where the problems are, and we touched on a lot of it today. But the soul of Islam is my personal relationship, an individual's personal relationship with God. Nobody else can decide. If I self identify as a Muslim, nobody can tell me I'm not a Muslim or apostatize me. If I self identify as a believer, non believer, if you really believe in a faith, that faith isn't worth two pennies if it needs human beings to protect it for God. God doesn't need anybody to protect their religion. So the soul of Islam is about me living in a laboratory where I can sin, where I can decide to do right or wrong, God will know that I am truly living where I can. We're fasting right now in Ramadan. And I always laugh hysterically at Ramadan in Saudi Arabia, which is supposedly the Mecca of Islam, because they close the restaurants during the day, they sleep all day, and then they're awake at night. That's not a fast. That's just a loophole of shifting your days and nights, and it's not you're not thirsty or you're sleeping through it. So these loopholes in which you create a society that's reflexively Islamic and not by choice Islamic is I think not the soul, and the soul of Islam is about choice, is about freedom to make a choice, and in order to prove that choice you have to be able to reject it and deny it and become some other faith and become Christian or Jewish or whatever that faith might be, so that truly you live in that laboratory.
Extraordinary, I would say brilliant.
Thank you.
Because this is what I actually talking about, that I was talking about, that put religion in personal sphere. And when you put religion in personal sphere, then you become the Muslim like yourself. So
Thank you.
it was really interesting. Thank you so much, Yudi, for being with us. It was such a huge pleasure to have you. And yes, there is a hope with reformists, and I acknowledge it, whether people don't do it. I seriously think if there is a hope, that lies with the reformists here in Islam, because in the attitude of Muslims, the reformation can be brought by discussions, and that the discussion, the kind of discussion we are having at the moment. And thank you so much
Thank you.
for giving us that opportunity and that hope. Thanks a lot.
Anytime. Take care. Pleasure.
Take care. Thank you so much. Bye
Yeah.
bye.